All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are very excited here at Whiskative to be hosting Sydney Moon for our webinar Lawless, Expanding Justice for Survivors with Lessons from the Margins today.
So I will introduce myself really briefly. My name is Sydney Moon, and I am an independent consultant at the moment. I worked in Seattle, Washington at an organization called the Northwest Network of Bisexual, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse for over 4 years. And in that time, actually, Heather and I had the joy of getting to facilitate the sexual assault support group, Thriving While Healing, together. And I was able to move into a role as the sexual assault advocacy coordinator at that organization. And I really loved and got so much out of my time being involved in anti-violence work at a culturally specific organization based in Washington. And this year I've been in just a huge amount of transition, definitely a little bit locked down by pandemic, but I am really excited to be getting to connect with you all this way and sharing a lot of what I've been thinking about and some of the resources that I've been consuming in this really huge moment. I want to take a moment as we get started to set some intention around honoring the Duwamish land that Seattle occupies and takes up. And so it's important to note that this kind of land acknowledgement isn't a new practice, even though sometimes it can feel that way for folks who aren't Native American or Indigenous American. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement can be a really powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of the specific land on which we're working and living. And so I would like to take just a moment to acknowledge that for folks who are, most of the folks who are coming to this webinar, we're occupying the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. There are some opportunities in here, and I do want to let folks know that we'll be sharing out slides after the webinar itself so that you're able to revisit a lot of the information, the links that are going to be shared in here. And so I really want to encourage you to get to spend time understanding some of the current issues that the Duwamish tribe is facing and tribes in your specific area might be facing. And so, for example, in 2015, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs ruled to deny federal recognition to the Duwamish tribe after a decades-long legal battle. And so today, as residents of Seattle, we can really continue to support the Duwamish in their struggle for justice. And in particular, they've called for us to write letters protesting the BIA's decision. And so there are links to be able to do that here, as well as to be able to pay rent to continue to uplift and support cultural practices and knowledge production coming from the Duwamish tribe. And then I, of course, wanted to take a moment to, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, to really recognize what's happening at the Navajo Nation, which has, as many folks probably know, the most COVID cases per capita, ahead of both New York and New Jersey. As of June 3rd, there were 5,533 reported cases and 248 deaths. And for folks who aren't aware, the Navajo Nation is the largest reservation in the United States in terms of population and area. And some of the challenges that they have been facing on their land are lacking adequate healthcare resources, hospital infrastructure. Over 30% of residents don't have running water, and a lack of paved roads really makes transporting aid especially difficult without more funding. And so there's a link here too for you to be able to learn more about what the current needs of the Navajo Nation are and how to support. So I'm pulling up this little definition of lawless here to just get to share with you all a bit about the impetus for this particular workshop. And so when Heather and I first started talking about this, it was actually before the uprisings in Minneapolis for Black Lives Matter had started. And we were really thinking about lessons from the margins for pandemic times. We're in the throes of really thinking about how COVID-19 was harming our communities disproportionately. And as soon as those uprisings started, they really began to illuminate the urgency with which we need to work to remedy our complicity as people involved in the domestic and sexual violence movement, or the movement to end intimate partner violence and sexual violence, the complicity in upholding white supremacy and state violence that we have. And so I think about Lawless, and particularly the second note that I have on the screen, contrary to the law, unlawful, and the ways in which people who are experiencing intimate violence that are part of communities that are actively criminalized are really constructed and construed as being unlawful and criminal simply for existing or for doing the things that they need to do to survive. And so that's going to be a really big part of what brings us into all of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I think that I really want to honor that people are going to be in incredibly different places in terms of their existing knowledge about carceral feminism, for example, or transformative justice or abolition feminism. And I'm trying to really support folks who might be new to this information, new to these frameworks, to be able to start digging into them. And I really want to encourage people to meet that with an open mind. And so with that, these are some of the goals that I've outlined for our time today. And I've italicized this first one, hone a shared liberatory anti-violence ethic, because I do think it's the most important and central. And everything else that we're going to be trying to achieve is really working in service of that goal. And so that includes examining and contending with the harms of policing in prisons as carceral responses to intimate violence, clarifying our roles in advocacy and our responsibilities, strengthening our frameworks and discernment for truly survivor-centered anti-racist advocacy, and identifying tangible strategies for a path forward. There are going to be some slides that look like this, where they're a little text heavy. And I know that that can be challenging in terms of accessibility, listening to me talk while you're trying to potentially read. And that's part of why I want to remind folks that we are going to be sending out the slides. And so you'll have access to this. And I wanted people to be able to have a lot of this information consolidated in one place. And I've done my very best to cite everything as clearly and specifically as I can, so that you are able to really quickly plug those things into an internet search and pull up more information, pull up the documents that they're sourced from. But I want to note that I think it's going to be really hard for us to get particularly far in our conversation today without revisiting what intersectionality is. And I know that this word's become a lot more commonplace, a lot more mainstream, and a lot of folks probably feel like, yeah, I understand that intersectionality is about how you have these different identities and the unique ways they interact with each other affects how you can navigate and experience the world. The term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in a paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. A lot of folks are probably familiar with the fact that Kimberly Crenshaw was coming from a very legal framework when she first conceptualized intersectionality. And I've bolded words here that it's a lens, that it's a prism, because I think that those are so important for us to be able to recognize the way that intersectionality really functions as it applies to the people that we're supporting and the people that we're fighting for when we're seeking to end intimate violence and end violence, period. And so it was also specifically the vastly varied experiences of domestic and sexual violence among Black women and other women of color, including immigrants, that inspired Kimberly Crenshaw's very detailed documentation of the disproportionate vulnerability to violence. So in her initial illustrations of this intersectional analysis, in Mapping the Margins, for example, she really was able to observe and articulate for us the dynamics with which she noticed Black women at battered women's shelters that she was working at during a brief field study in LA, that those experiences were really merely the most immediate manifestation of the subordination that Black women were experiencing. And so Crenshaw was really calling on us to also confront the multi-layered, routinized forms of domination that were converging in Black women's lives, hindering their ability to create alternatives to the abuse, the abusive relationships that brought them to shelter in the first place. And I think a lot of us are probably really familiar with the ways that some survivors, because of their specific identities, struggle to access programs and have vastly different experiences of programs that may be designed with a particular type of victim or survivor in mind. I'm going to take a moment also for us to get to honor the magnitude of death that we're seeing in the media right now as murders of Black folks, particularly Black women, especially Black trans women, are really being exposed in a way that is unprecedented in our history. And I say being exposed because these types of murders, these police murders, state-sanctioned violence, as well as intimate violence disproportionately impacting Black people in the United States is not new by any means. And the scale of it is not necessarily new by any means, though the permutations of it are really ever evolving and shifting. And so when I think about it, honoring our dead, and I'll bring like a little bit of Pacific Northwest witchiness to you, I really think about invoking memories as a type of magic, a balm, a salve in our work. And for folks who might be like me and interested in thinking about how we relate to death and sort of shifting maybe really Western ideas of death and mortality as inherently bad. Some people might be familiar with the death positivity movement. A lot of folks likely aren't. The death positivity movement, like the sex positivity movement, really seeks to help us understand the ways in which there's good death and bad death. And in a good death, we get to have our autonomy and our self-determination in getting to plan and prepare for what our end of life might be, and to be able to really have our wishes honored in how our remains might be handled and how our memory might be held by the people we love. And in bad death, people are denied access to that process. And we certainly would think of murder as bad death. But there are so many people, because of the material conditions of our lives, who are systematically denied access to good death, whether because of violence and discrimination from the medical industry, because of poverty, because of intimate violence, that so many people are denied that. And so I think that it's important to, when we're honoring death, to really examine and address the underlying issues that adversely affect marginalized communities' experiences of death. And I'm sure some people recognize some of the beautiful artwork that will be within this presentation, as well as the names of people featured here. And I want to take a moment to really acknowledge, in particular, the transgender and gender diverse, gender nonconforming people who were fatally shot or killed by other violent means in this year so far. And in 2020, we have already seen at least 15 trans folks murdered that we know of, right, that have come to light in a public way. And so you'll see here, Nina Pop, Dominique Remy Fells, Tony McDade, Rhea Milton. And I want to invite everybody, while we take just a moment, to honor these lives that were taken from us, to be able to write into the chat box about anybody, the name of anyone who you might be grieving or carrying with you into your work right now. And while folks do that, I'm going to take a moment to read the names of people who are trans, gender nonconforming, that we have lost so far this year. Dustin Parker, Nulisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Mendez Arrocho, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Johanna Metzger, Serena Angelique Velasquez Ramos, Leila Pelaez Sanchez, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, Nina Pop, Hele J. O'Regan, Tony McDade, Dominique Remy Fells, Rhea Milton, and Jane Thompson. I invoke these names as a means for us to really situate ourselves in remembering who we work for and who we work with. And that a huge function of our role in trying to interrupt and prevent and ultimately end intimate violence is to familiarize ourselves with the way that intimate violence and state violence disproportionately impact specific people based on their identities. And trans women of color, trans Black women in particular, are really facing a pandemic of violence that calls on all of us to focus our attention on how to better show up to them in their lives and honor them in life. If folks want to take a moment to type into the chat, I would love to hear, what are some ways that you honor and integrate the dead into your work, or ways that you feel that we should integrate the dead into our work? An honor walk. Family gatherings. Thanks for sharing that, Judy. Ellen, I appreciate you talking about acknowledging and valuing, following the lead of people that you're working with directly in their lives. I think that that's an important way of honoring the dead too. Some social media, in-person vigils, candlelight vigils. I think that all of these ritual elements and memorial efforts that we have are really important. And I want to hold with us too, as sort of a major question driving this webinar, who's disproportionately subjected to bad death in our culture? Do our supports reach them in life? Why or why not? What conditions would need to change in order to prevent needless bad death? And beyond this, to really create loving, equitable, liberated communities that are free from violence. And so that's what this discussion today is really trying to get us toward, is how can the mainstream movement to end gendered violence align itself with the Black freedom struggle, with the movement for Native sovereignty and decolonization broadly, to create a world that's free from violence. And so in legal work in particular, I'm sure a lot of you know, we can really distance ourselves from the corporeal, visceral nature of death. And so I'm inviting people to take a moment to get a little closer to it. And I wanna also honor and recognize that the content in this webinar is going to affect different people differently. And so for some people, particularly Black folks, there will be a lot of focus on state violence, anti-Black state violence that disproportionately harms and kills Black people. And I want to encourage folks who are particularly affected by that to take space, to take time times away from it or times out. There will be a recording that you can come back to, of course. And I want to push people, white folks and particularly non-Black people of color, to sit with some of the discomfort and that proximity to violence, because it's a really important facet of being in touch with the material consequences of our work. And so I would say, right, that one of the biggest ways that we can honor our dead is to really transform the conditions that lead to senseless violence and bad death. This is a photo or a portrait done by Mika Pazan of Cece McDonald, a young Black trans woman in Minneapolis who fought off a racist transphobic attack. She stabbed her attacker in the process, and although it was a clear case of self-defense, Cece was sentenced to 41 months in a men's prison. Throughout her ordeal, she was very clear that prisons and police don't serve or protect trans people, and that she didn't believe that they could create more safety or that they do create safety. And so part of what I want to carry with us is really honoring the demands and the needs of Black people, Black women, and especially Black trans women in calling for us to envision a different world that would be free from violence. Folks are probably really familiar with this Angela Davis quote, and I just loved seeing these photos roll out of Angela Davis from a protest or an assembly for Juneteenth in Oakland, where she's really rolling through the community in this car like the incredible thinker and legend that she is for all of us. And a lot of people, I think, as I mentioned, have probably seen this quote from her about being anti-racist circulating in this particular moment when there are a lot of folks who are trying to grapple with what it really means to be anti-racist and to deepen their commitment to anti-racist work. We're going to start moving into a little bit more of the dynamic part of this webinar. There's going to be some interactive activities for us. And then I also want to let folks know that what I've put together is really quite dense. And there's going to be a lot of framework and statistics that's included on these slides. And it might feel like to some people that I'm breezing through this. Other people might be really familiar with these frameworks and with these numbers. And I wanted to keep them all here so that you could come back to them. You could revisit and read more. There's going to be a lot of highlighted resources for you to do more in-depth learning if you want to and are able to. But it's just a small note about what the pacing might feel like at times so that we can get through the most important parts and really prioritize the interactive and engaging parts of our time together. Okay, so I'd love to start by hearing from you all. What are ways that the law expects survivors of domestic and sexual violence to present themselves? I'm thinking particularly in court or in any kind of legal case proceeding that they may have. Calm, collected, well-spoken. As a victim, says Judy. Calm, not emotional. What else? This doesn't have to be, of course, and I'm actually not asking you how you would want participants or survivors, victims that you're working with to perform or show up, but certainly how the law would expect them to be. Stoic, yeah, really not to show any of their trauma or other mental health diagnoses, complexities that folks might be navigating. Linear. And I should mention too, as another note about language, is that I will use the language of victims and survivors. I know that we often, in a legal context, we might use the word, or the law might really use the word victim of a crime. And in an advocacy context, we would really focus on survivorship. And I'm absolutely a person of the mind that anything that somebody does in the course of surviving is part of their survivorship. It makes them a survivor. The act of living through the violence is survivorship. And I want to just honor that there's actually a lot of complexity to how people self-identify with those terms, and that I don't want us to set up a dichotomy or to approach those terms with value judgments. And I will often also use victims and survivors to really call in the dead and folks who were not able to survive, because they're a huge part of our fight as well. And so I'm like, here I am. I just said that I'm not going to put Shoshana, the perfect victim. Thank you. I was like, here I am saying that I wasn't going to put them side by side in some kind of binary. And as folks are brainstorming, you know, we heard of a lot of like this calm, demure, respectful, but the law really privileges a certain type of presentation. Yeah, I see professional, you know, of not wearing clothing that's revealing. And so if we were to think of, for example, a criminal rape trial in the most like narrow scope of what the law would want for someone to present as a good victim or a perfect victim, right? That would be a feminine, cisgender, heterosexual white woman. The rape would have been perpetrated by a cisgender man. She would present with conservative dress. She would have a consistent linear narrative of the assault. The rape would probably have only taken place once. She wouldn't have been repeatedly abused. She would have no previous amicable relationship with the rapist. She would have lots of outside evidence to validate her story: DNA, clothing, witnesses, video footage. No supposedly deviant sexual history, would have reported it immediately, as Brooke just shared into the chat. She wouldn't engage with the rapist after the attack. She likely would have been physically overpowered during the assault. She would do nothing to retaliate or organize against the rapist, seek revenge in any way, or take matters into her own hands. She would, at least in the eyes of the court, believe that justice would be served. And she would actively participate and want to do everything the right way. And so this notion of a perfect victim is something that we ask people to approximate in a lot of legal work, whether that's immigration related or civil, whether it's divorces. And most of us would recognize, I think, that that's not a realistic box. Essentially, no one fits all of those descriptors, but they do reflect really culturally held beliefs. And those beliefs can show up and be ingrained in our programs, even in small ways. In contrast, I would love if people can take a moment to throw things into the chat about who are our bad survivors, these inconvenient, imperfect, deviant, difficult to work with. As you might remember from the description of this webinar, that's exactly the type of survivorship that we're going to be talking about today. Sex workers, thanks Jenna. People who actively use drugs, were angry, seen as acting out, fighting, history of fighting, or having okay, I'm like, oh, well, the chat, they're coming in. Okay, unhoused, doesn't speak English as their first language, potentially, fearful to cooperate. Yeah, anyone who's navigating mental illness, folks who are navigating disabilities, who are disabled by the culture we live in. Yeah, the notion of, as Ty, I hope I said that right, staying in your abuse, right? These factors of like, why would you stay? Lots of judgment placed on those folks. You know, and on a structural level, this would disproportionately be queer and trans people of color. It would be Black people, people who are indigenous to the Americas and the Pacific Islands, poor, disabled, people in the sex trade, people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And that's a lot of people. As another question for you all, when we think about interacting with the police, interacting with law enforcement, in an ideal scenario, what do we expect will or should happen when somebody contacts 911 about domestic violence in particular? How do we think that that system is supposed to function for survivors? Police arrive right away. That law enforcement would contact advocates to help. The survivor would be believed, the survivor wouldn't be arrested. That calling the police, as Jennifer says, would increase safety. I'm gonna draw our attention to this really amazing graphic that Survived and Punished put together in their curricula on criminalizing survival, right? And this is a really narrow scope, but if we follow it, there's a crisis, and it would operate in a totally heterosexual, cisgender relationship where the partners were married. A wife who was being battered by a husband would call 911, and then help would arrive. The police would arrive to help the survivor. There would be safety or arrest. Maybe the notion of those things would go right hand in hand, right? Survivor would maybe, and her children would get to go to a shelter or to be sheltered safely, and the batterer would go to jail. The police would treat it seriously by arresting. I think a lot of us know that that's not what typically happens, and that people are treated really differently by police based on their identities and experiences, as the framework of intersectionality offers us. So what are examples of things that might happen instead? To flip the one that Rebecca just shared, maybe the survivor would be made to wait for an incredibly long amount of time in order to get an exam. The crisis is swayed to believe the perpetrator, nothing happens. Not believed, victim blaming, arrested, abused, disrespected. Survivor is intimidated, CPS becomes involved. That could mean that a survivor or victim loses their children. And so this alternative diagram, right, shows us some of the complications that might take place. So there's a crisis. Two people are having a conflict as part of a pattern of domestic violence. They could be straight, they might be queer. They could be a couple of any gender. And so 911 is dispatched, somebody makes a call. Who's the survivor? There might be a mandatory arrest policy in place. That means that somebody has to be arrested, and perhaps both people might be arrested. Maybe the survivor alone is arrested. Survivor might be detained, charged with a crime. Survivor could lose custody of children. Survivor's information could be passed on to ICE. Does the survivor have a prior record? Do they speak English as their first language? Are they undocumented? Did they fight back? Are they sympathetic enough of a victim, right? Do they comport to that perfect victim archetype? I see Brooke, of course, also sharing that there could be just police brutality. Not only could cops shoot somebody who is involved in this interaction, but it could deploy police into a really vulnerable neighborhood where there might be lots of other people who are actively criminalized that police might treat poorly, brutalize, arrest. I want to draw our attention really quick to this report that was done by the National LGBTQ Domestic Violence Capacity Building Learning Center, which has now become a national institute, the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence. In 2015, they partnered with the National Domestic Violence Hotline to explore the impact of mandatory reporting specifically on the help-seeking behaviors of people experiencing domestic violence or reaching out for help around domestic violence. And so 3,616 survivors and help seekers completed this survey. Half of participants who had been reported said that it made the situation much worse. And the majority of participants, 82%, said that the report made the situation worse or had no impact. In contrast, only 3% of people said that a mandatory report to law enforcement made their situation much better. And 15% said that it made the situation a little bit better. And so given the reluctance of many domestic violence survivors to lean on criminal justice as an intervention, it's really important for us to be thinking about how we're increasing survivors' access to competent support and resources from other sources. Because of this, the pervasive sense that policing won't bring safety, particularly for Black people who are experiencing intimate violence, for Native, Indigenous people who are experiencing intimate violence, we really have to be pushing ourselves to think of something else. These are some additional statistics that I think are really important for understanding police violence and how it disproportionately impacts some of the most marginalized people in our communities. And how when we put these folks at the center, we really can't justify that this is the intervention we want to get behind. A lot of folks have probably seen a statistic moving around about domestic violence in police households, that 40% of police households are known or reported to have domestic violence in them, where police are perpetrators or batterers. And I think it's so important to sit with that for a moment and think about, like, where else would I be comfortable with having 40% of the people, nearly half of the people who were supposedly supposed to be supporting me or providing me with vital resources, keeping me safe, were people who were involved in battering in their own home, right? A lot of us wouldn't feel okay if that was 40% of teachers, if that was 40% of domestic violence advocates. That number is really high. And we see also here, right, sexual violence is the second most commonly reported kind of police misconduct. That's something that's well documented by Andrea Ritchie and other folks who have really been behind the Say Her Name efforts in partnership or in tandem with Black Lives Matter. And so, and in addition, I think just to really spend time with, right, how couples that are seen as same sex or that are queer relationships are 10 to 15 times more likely to result in dual arrest, that disabled people make up a third to half of all police murder victims. We likely can think of quite a few people with epilepsy or with significant mental health concerns, with really severe depression or in a mental health crisis, who we know have been murdered by police. And of course, the type of coercion, extortion, and assault that's really commonplace for how police relate to people in the sex trade who are actively criminalized. So let's talk about how we interact with and relate to policing in our work. Take a moment to write into the chat or brainstorm on a piece of paper 3 examples, no matter how small, of ways that your organization interacts with policing. Members of the police department on our board of directors, on the board. We have a DV advocate on site with local police. We make police reports, assist survivors, they refer to us, so we get referrals. Elizabeth, I'm assuming that when you say train on trauma-informed interviewing, you're talking about training the police, board members, mobile crisis teams. We used to be a part of the department, says Olivia. I'm really interested for folks to think about potentially mandated reporting and what your organization's policies might be. Anybody who's co-located with police, right, might be part of a family justice center something that's thought of as a one-stop shop. A 99% of intervention training that's taught involves the police, protection orders, reporting in general, Sister Shauna. You know, I think in a really small way in legal advocacy, we also tend to lean on policing or think about the benefits that a report to police or even in immigration remedies, right, that cooperation with police might benefit or strengthen a case. Referrals from police, referring people to police. And I'm gonna hit y'all with a small one that I want like as homework for everybody to go check, which is, does your website say to call 911 in case of an emergency? So many websites for folks in our field offer calling the police as the primary intervention if, you know, it's outside of your work hours, or if it's supposedly more of a crisis than what would warrant calling the domestic violence hotline or calling your office. And so check on it as a little bit of homework, and we'll talk about that more. I bet a lot of people are familiar with what the prison industrial complex is. I'm including a definition here for everybody. It's a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of the government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems, right? And so it's offering those tools, surveillance, policing, imprisonment, as interventions and solutions for challenges in our communities, including domestic and sexual violence. And I'm sure that people are also starting to get really familiar with, if you weren't already, about what mass incarceration means or looks like in this country. I highlight here the number of Black young people that are designated as boys or socialized as boys, and Latinx children socialized as boys, the disproportionate rates at which they can expect to be imprisoned in their lifetimes. The term hyper-incarceration, I think, is a really important one because it really draws attention to how different communities and people, based on their social identities or categories that they're relegated to, are disproportionately targeted by mass incarceration and roped into mass incarceration or oppressed by mass incarceration. And so in the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and at a moment where the Black freedom struggle is reaching a new era of transformation, I would hope that people are really familiar with the disproportionate rate at which Black people are incarcerated, right? 5 times the rate of white people, in some states 10 to 1. And often in media, in campaigns that are drawing attention to the violence of the prison industrial complex and policing, there's a lot of focus on Black cisgender men. Up to 94% of some women's prison populations are survivors of sexual assault or physical abuse. And the women's prison population is the fastest growing in our country. And it's really important for us to take a look at the unique and specific ways that gender plays a role in how the prison industrial complex harms our communities. There's a really excellent report from Georgetown University Law Center that I encourage folks to check out about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. It documents that phenomenon really well, and really gives us the evidence to understand how sexual abuse is one of the primary predictors of girls' entry into the juvenile justice system. And of course, when I say girls, I'm talking about people who are being categorized, designated as, or socialized as girls. there are certainly some complications in a lot of the data in terms of being able to understand how gender diverse folks, I say that to really be able to include people who are two-spirit, hijra, who represent different and distinct cultural notions of gender beyond what we might think of in the like a Western framework as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. This is Kai Peterson, and I've talked about Kai in another workshop that I did that was really focused on fantasies of revenge and really being able to honor survivors who act in self-defense, who use violence in the course of surviving, and who live out a kind of fantasy that of revenge that so many survivors of intimate violence experience as a part of their trauma, as a psychological phenomenon, and as like a perfectly healthy part of their experience to process. And of course, in reality, when folks, particularly people who are Black, people who are disabled, who are trans, gender diverse, use violence to defend themselves in their lives, they are severely punished. I'm going to read a little bit about Kai's story. I've put it up here. I know that that's a lot of text on a slide, but I included it for folks who might prefer to read or for whom the text is easier than the audio. And so Kai's story begins in 2011 for us, where Kai was waiting for his two brothers. Kai was 20 years old. His brothers were 14 and 16 at the time. They were waiting outside of a convenience store in his hometown of Americus, Georgia, when a man approached him and began asking him questions about his gender identity in a transphobic assault. Due to the man's behavior and Kai's previous experiences of physical and sexual assault, Kai was afraid and began walking away from the man as that man followed and continued to approach him. As Kai walked through a trailer park toward his home, he felt something hit him on the back of the head. When he woke up, the man was raping him. Kai began to scream and further fight for his life. Kai's brothers had since left the convenience store. They heard him screaming and rushed to help. Even after they intervened to pull the man off of Kai, the man continued to charge at Kai. And it was at this point that Kai shot and killed the man with a gun from his backpack. Later that night, Kai and his three brothers, who had had previous encounters with the police and with criminalization, returned to the trailer to try and bury the man's body in the woods. The next day, the police arrived at the Petersons' home, and Kai was taken to the precinct where he was questioned for hours. After questioning, police drove Kai to a local clinic for a rape exam. During the rape exam, Kai remembers the woman administering the exam telling him that he didn't look like a victim. The rape kit confirmed that Kai had recently endured forceful vaginal and anal penetration, and an autopsy of the attacker found Peterson's DNA on the man's penis. Still, the police insisted that Kai, who they construed as a woman, had lured the man into a trailer with promises of sex to set him up to be robbed by his brothers. Kai was charged with armed robbery, aggravated assault, felony murder, possession of a firearm, and malice murder. According to statements made by Kai's public defender, they denied his right to plead self-defense because Kai is Black and, quote, looks stereotypically gay. After sitting in jail for a year, Kai was forced to sign a plea deal while on heavy mental health medications. Kai believed he signed a deal charging him with involuntary manslaughter, which carries a 10-year sentence. However, Kai was sentenced to 20 years in prison with 15 years of those years in confinement. On February 27, 2012, Kai was charged with armed robbery, aggravated assault, felony murder, possession of a firearm, and malice murder. And Kai believed that he was signing a deal charging him with involuntary manslaughter, which carries that 10-year sentence, but Kai was sentenced to 20 years. Kai has been in prison for over 8 years at this point. Everyone who's sitting somewhere on the other line of my audio can take a deep breath. I know that that's hard to listen to, and it's really upsetting. When folks are ready, I'm gonna have everybody take a moment to respond to these questions, and I'm actually gonna break you up into 3 groups, which I know is a little weird to do over a webinar, but we're gonna do it.
Okay, so just to recap, the questions are: what factors that led to Kai's criminalization? How did Kai's race, class, and gender impact his criminalization? And so we have, because of his race, he was accused of being the one who is guilty as opposed to being the victim or survivor.
We also definitely see that his, right, with his gender, he wasn't seen as being a survivor or of being able to have claim to being a victim. And that's part of what I mean. Beth talks about that a little bit here, thank you. That's part of what I mean about the importance of being able to honor people's claim to victim status too, when people are denied that. Unable to afford a private attorney or bail, right? Being in jail for a year. I don't have it in the version that I've included here, but as I remember it, Kai was only able to meet with his public defender once, maybe twice in the entire year that he waited in jail. Yeah, in a lot of ways, to Ellen's point, Kai's identity as a man, and a trans man specifically, is just like erased and made unreal by the law.
Yeah, and then we have that Kai's race made them already a target of violence from the legal system, and then also Kai's class background, they're just being more overlap with already having experience with encounters with law enforcement and lack of privacy, and then his gender was targeted by the perpetrator. I feel like that's something that hasn't been mentioned yet, but yeah, and then weaponized against him, you know, during the ensuing criminalization.
Yeah, Kai, I don't want to misspeak, but I'm almost 100% positive. I would say 92% positive that Kai continues to be in a women's prison. I'm going to actually move that to 99%. I think I read that yesterday. Would love to hear from Group B to share your responses to the question, were there any points where a positive intervention might have made a difference for Kai? What might those interventions have been? Bystanders, says Judy. Yeah, appropriate, trans, competent, and affirming sexual assault forensic exam or medical treatment, period, even if it wasn't a forensic exam. Yeah, adequate legal representation, of course. Access to an advocate could have been a supportive intervention. Of course, it would depend on if the advocate was familiar with and affirming of trans people, of Black people. Even our advocacy programs are not immune from racism, transphobia, classism. Yeah, definitely trauma-informed medical care. Access to a strong and competent legal defense. And what about Group C? What alternative ways could this incident have been handled? I know that that goes really hand in hand with Group B's question. Janine points out also that Kai was on mental health medications. It doesn't, from the version of his story that we have, he wasn't provided an opportunity to have adequate psychological care or to have his legal team recognize the needs that he might have around psychological or therapeutic support. Ty would want to see if Kai's case could be heard from a different judge, from another area, to point out and indicate that the language used against Kai is discriminatory, his treatment is discriminatory, that could be submitted to demonstrate bias. Those are all things that could bolster Kai's defense. Thank you all for taking the time to do that exercise with me. And if people have lingering thoughts, or if you didn't get to send yours in with your group, you can go ahead and still put it into the chat so that other people and Heather can kind of track that and engage with you there. If you want to put your letter in front of it, that could definitely help. We know that queer and trans youth are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. And I think it's really important to also just talk about age and how youth are really railroaded, funneled into our juvenile justice system. 85% of LGBTQ, gender nonconforming youth who are entrenched in the juvenile justice system are youth of color. And young people as their own group experience all kinds of really difficult, challenging barriers to being able to access support when they're experiencing violence at home, violence in the community, and of course, violence when they're in state systems. So moving from our perfect victims, bad survivors framework, I wanna shift us toward a place where we take ownership of all victims and all survivors, that they're ours in the sense that they're like us and connected to our struggles, and that we have a collective responsibility toward them. Of course, not to signify any kind of ownership, but that we have that real responsibility to be breaking down and dismantling a perfect victim archetype, to show up for the broad range of experiences that survivors have, especially when we know that it is disproportionately Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color who are going to be facing challenges in using the police or a criminal legal response as any kind of meaningful intervention toward justice in their lives. Right? And so survivors needs to include people with prior arrests and criminal records, undocumented immigrants, sex workers, people who work in street economies, people who use or sell substances. It's important for us to challenge the idea that survivors and criminals are two diametrically opposed groups. And that comes from Survived and Punished. You'll see a lot of their content and thinking put forth in this webinar, and I really encourage people to do as much work as you can to engage with all of the knowledge production that they've provided for our field on this specific topic, to start ensuring that our programs and our work in the workplace and outside of it in our communities really can show up to these challenges and to these needs. So I want to also take a moment to talk about Layleen Polanco Extravaganza, who is a 27-year-old Afro-Latina trans woman who passed away from complications related to a seizure in June 2019. The New York Department of Corrections tweeted the following day that initial investigations determined her death was not the result of violence or foul play, and it stood by those conclusions after a 6-month inquiry that resulted in no criminal charges being filed against Rikers Island. Polanco was being held in Rikers on failure to pay $500 bail, resulting from bench warrants, which are warrants that are issued when an individual does not appear in court, related to an August 2017 arrest. The arrest was the result of an NYPD sting investigation after Polanco allegedly agreed to perform oral sex on an undercover officer in exchange for money. She was arrested for misdemeanor prostitution and low-level drug possession offense, and she was required to appear in Manhattan's Human Trafficking Intervention Court to receive counseling services, an alternative to jail time that's often presented by judges to those arrested on prostitution charges in these specific courts in New York. Some people might be familiar with them. I've sat in on them when I was doing legal advocacy in New York. New evidence calls those conclusions into question. Footage published by NBC News on Saturday shows that guards posted in punitive segregation, which is where Layleen Polanco was being housed, delayed intervention even as Polanco was unresponsive. Prison guards waited 47 minutes to check on her, checking in once at 1:42 p.m. and then a second time at 2:27 p.m. And despite the fact that internal guidelines require Rikers Island officials to check on individuals placed in solitary confinements every 15 minutes in fear of suicide attempts. There was a story that was released that I'll highlight later about Layleen Polanco Extravaganza's experience that shows that video footage revealed not only that the guards were negligent as Layleen was having an episode or crisis that resulted in her death, but that those guards were laughing at her in her cell while she struggled for her life. I'm gonna again invite everybody to take a breath. What does Layleen's story reveal about the cascading impacts of criminalization? Whenever you're ready, you can send thoughts into the chat. But let's think about like what led to this arrest, this jail time. Yeah, Tanya says it's lethal. And as someone pointed out earlier about Kai and not being able to afford bail, right, a $500 bail is not particularly high in terms of what our legal system is known to do. So Leticia is right about poverty being an incredibly big factor in Layleen's criminalization and her death. I would push us to think about how the original charge that the bench warrant was for, how that came to be. Yeah, Jenna talking about criminalization of street economy, sex work, survival sex. I think we should all be considering if it's appropriate for police officers to go undercover to request or agree to pay to sexual services, if that's something that somebody who is in the sex trade can actually consent to. To Beatrice's question, it was determined that Layleen died from complications related to a seizure. And there may be some other folks that we can recall who have epilepsy that we know have died from interactions with police or in police custody. Jenna points out that the goal of the human trafficking courts, supposedly to save trafficking victims, resulted in this criminalization and this death. And the framework behind that model really being that mandating people into services is for their own good or as a way to save people from victimization. It's certainly operates out of a model that that doesn't understand sex work as viable work. So I appreciate everybody's responses, and I want to move us into thinking about not just how people who experience sexual violence are imprisoned, disproportionately incarcerated, related to their experiences as sexual violence. When talking about the childhood sexual abuse to prison pipeline, one of the things noted in that study from Georgetown Law Center is that it is the exact kinds of behaviors like truancy and running away that are ways that young people who are being sexually abused might cope with sexual violence that are highly criminalized and lend themselves to incarcerating young people. That's part of why that overrepresentation exists. in this slide, and this is going to be one of those parts where I pull us through a lot of information, and I encourage you to circle back to it later when there's more time. I really wanted to highlight this last point. I put in italics: more than 50% of the sexual contact between inmate and staff member, all of which is illegal, is non-consensual, in quotes, right? And I want to point to that same dynamic with the undercover officer soliciting sex as a way to arrest Laylene for exchanging sex or for having drugs on her. In that dynamic, there's no opportunity with that level of power for sexual relationships to be consensual. I would assert that it's a complete abuse of power that makes it sexual assault and rape. The same way that teachers should not have the same way that we might think about teachers and statutory rape and the inability of younger people to consent to that power dynamic. I'm thinking of all of these ways in which that can be complicated in terms of survival sex and folks' autonomy. They're doing what they need to do to survive. And in the course of surviving prison, I would assert that it's not possible to be consensual. Trans people who are incarcerated disproportionately experience sexual assault, like Laylene and Kai. They are disproportionately put in solitary confinement, with a notion of solitary being for their own protection. The statistic from Black and Pink about respondents who reported being sexually assaulted, I think is really an important one, that 76% of those who had been assaulted by other prisoners reported that staff had intentionally placed them in situations that increased the likelihood of assault. Some examples of that can be being forced to share living space or be in a cell with somebody who's known to already have sexually assaulted somebody. I want to draw attention to the case, to Ashley Diamond's case. Ashley Diamond in 2012 attempted to buy $9 worth of stencils, and unknown to her, those stencils had been stolen. She was arrested for attempting to buy stolen property. And similar to Laylene, that arrest triggered a violation of a 15-year probation on her previous charge, which was attempting to pawn a saw that also turned out to be stolen. Diamond is Black. She's an openly trans woman living in Rome, Georgia at the time, in a town of 36,000 people. For those two incidents, a judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison. Diamond was sent to Mason, which is one of Georgia's maximum security men's prisons. And within 30 days, she reports that she was brutally gang raped. In her entire time experiencing incarceration, she has experienced profound and repeated sexual violence. And in the time so far that she has been incarcerated, I wanted to just check how many years that is. 7 or 8 years at the time, I believe that this number comes from. Diamond had experienced more than 7 brutal sexual assaults. And in a video testimony, she talks about being put in situations that actively put her at risk or put her in danger. And so I want us to think about how the prison can function to perpetuate rape as a rapist, when we often are positioned to think about it as a place where bad people and rapists should go. And this is something that Dean Spade talks a lot about. So this is the way that I want to challenge us to think about the overlap of state violence and intimate violence, because often we really separate state violence as a phenomenon. Hate violence might be a distinct phenomenon. Intimate violence or gender-based violence, gendered violence might be its own phenomenon. And actually, in the center of that Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap. The hate motivation that leads to criminalization, that disproportionately subjects vulnerable people to violence, the way that the state criminalizes and pushes people through a system that subjects them to further violence, and of course that gender-based intimate violence that, if we backtrack for a sec, right, was perhaps the more simple notion of domestic violence or sexual violence that we were holding. And every time that the state, that the prison functions to condone and perpetuate rape, that rape is an act of intimate violence. And so all of these really fit together as tools of domination within a culture, a patriarchal culture that asserts that domination is a way to exert power over people, right? And we see that parallel between state violence and intimate violence in particular, that the state can assert domination through police and prisons in the same way that a batterer might do that in the home. As intentionally or malevolently or not, as we might think of those forces, they're functioning in upholding these dynamics of white supremacy, racism, cis heteropatriarchy, imperialism, capitalism, and I'm sure the list could go on, but really within a culture that asserts that domination is a tool for power. So this is the first of many book club moments that I'm going to bring to you in my webinar. This is part of why I want you to get to have all these slides in the end. I have broken down moments in this workshop, or this webinar, where there will be sort of a summary of the types of material that inform my research and that help put some of this thinking together. And so these are tools that I think will be helpful to you in thinking through these dynamics about domination and the intersections of state and intimate violence. I'm going to take us through some definitions to look at carceral feminism, which really articulates this active mobilization of the criminal justice system as a response originally to sex trafficking, and now used more generally to describe the mainstream forms of feminism associated with addressing gender violence. And this label points to decades of feminist anti-violence collaboration with the carceral state, or that part of the government most associated with the institutions of police, prosecution, courts, systems of jails, prisons, probation, parole. So we're gonna do a little survey at this point. Heather, would you mind putting that up for folks? So take a moment to fill this out, and then we'll look at the responses together. So take a moment to just notice what the answers look like. There are a lot of folks who have supported survivors who've used violence in the course of surviving. I'm curious if anybody wants to speak a little bit about the second prompt. I can and do work with people who actively trade sex with no expectation or requirement to exit the sex trade. It's a little bit cut off there, but I'm hopeful that everybody understood it. If folks want to share a little bit about whether your organization simply doesn't work with many people who engage in the sex trade, or if your organization might have some kind of requirement about exiting the sex trade or not being able to actively be a sex worker or actively be trading sex throughout services. I'm not seeing responses to that particular prompt, but I would encourage people to think about it, what kind of resources you have or active programs you have for engaging with people who are sex workers or in the sex trade. I see 50% of people reporting, indicating that they would have to make a mandated report about self-harm for a person under 18. Mandated reporting laws, of course, vary state by state, but I think that's a really clear indicator about the importance of reviewing and revisiting mandated reporting policies, being really clear about the law, and understanding when, why, how you would be invoking a systems response in response to something like self-harm, a coping strategy. Are there any reflections or noticings that people would be willing to share in the chat about these responses? Ways you felt when you filled it out, curiosities you had, things that stood out to you. If someone discloses they were raped by a police officer, Kyle indicated that. Not feeling clear about what kind of support you might offer. I think that question really gets at this conflict about who holds police accountable, right? Or what structures exist for police or agents of state systems like prison guards to be accountable when they commit acts of violence against people. So I'm going to exit out of this poll so that we can keep rolling through. And I want to highlight this graph that Mimi Kim includes in a really excellent article from carceral feminism to transformative justice about the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And you can really see this timeline of the history of the anti-violence movement and the massive increase in the rate of incarceration. And so there's a history here that I want to draw our attention to. Some people might be more familiar with it than others. Beth Ritchie talks about this as winning the mainstream but losing the movement. And in articles like Remembering Who We Work For, the letter to the anti-rape movement from 1977, we can see a really clear historical documentation of how women of color were protesting the alignment of what was at that time a grassroots social justice peer-led movement to become a really professionalized service provision oriented industry, a nonprofit industry, right? That wasn't working as much with people for their liberation necessarily as it was trying to provide a service. And that really worked to increase criminalization of domestic and sexual violence as a way of legitimating that they were harms. And so I encourage folks to take time to read this zine that was put together by Miriam Kaba of Project Mia and who works with Survived and Punished, that responds to and brings back to light this open letter to the anti-rape movement. And it can be really startling to read in the year 2020, because while there's certain parts of it that might feel a little dated, it reads like the conversation we're having right now about how we understand prisons, policing, surveillance, and if these can be tools to actually support the people that we purport to serve, to actually support survivors of intimate violence. You know, if so, which ones? Feminist political theorist Charlotte Bunch suggests that feminism as a political perspective is about change and structures, about ending domination and resisting oppression. By this definition, prisons cannot be feminist. That's something that Miriam Kaba writes in the zine. And it was something I thought about a lot when I put together that Venn diagram that you all saw earlier about how state violence is intimate violence. Because all of those tools are functioning to legitimate domination and patriarchal domination, which is at odds with what we're trying to end. And so there's a lot of contending in this zine about whether or not those tools can be used to as a means to justify the end we want, right? To eradicate violence in our communities. So having talked about as much as we have at this point, I'm gonna pause us for a second to ask, what are you hoping to examine more closely at your organization when you think about pursuing actively anti-racist advocacy? Yeah, Tess is like, our relationship with law enforcement. Who's on our board? There were folks who definitely talked about law enforcement representation on boards earlier, safety planning, other options that don't include calling 911. Yeah, really trying to get outside of this framework that we've been really complicit in. So that brings us to a new framework I want to offer folks, which is abolition feminism. And I'm certainly not saying that everybody on this call needs to identify as a present abolitionist today. But what I want to encourage people to do is to think really seriously about it. And I want people to start that thinking yesterday. And so Angela Davis describes abolition feminism as a liberatory vision of a world free from all forms of violence, including those produced by carceral logics and systems of surveillance, policing, punishment, and exile. Abolition feminism envisions a society based on radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity. In this society, safety and security will not be premised on violence or the threat of violence. It will be based on a collective commitment to guaranteeing the survival and care of all of our people. That all sounds like really amazing. And I think that when we, a lot of folks are probably exposed to ideas about transformative justice at this point. And sometimes it can sound or be dismissed as being really utopian. And I think what's really important about the work of getting on board with abolition, of acknowledging and listening to the Black queer feminists and survivors who have been putting forth this knowledge for 4+ decades, is that it's not asking us to care less about safety or to take it less seriously. It's asking us to really care more deeply about all of those people that our field has left out of its vision and strategies for justice. And I think about what it would take for Laylene and Kai and Diamond to really be guaranteed in their safety and care. Book club moment. I would definitely encourage people to, if you didn't already, to go back and watch the recording of Abolition Feminism, celebrating 20 years of Insight. It was a really wonderful workshop, presentation, kind of a teach-in, kind of like going to a conference remotely from your living room because we're living in a pandemic. And it highlights a lot of this thinking and this trajectory over time. So as people were identifying things they want to turn, their thinking toward, I want to push us to start coming at those challenges, the work that is ahead of us with our strengths. And so what are some strengths that we bring, that we already have in the advocacy we do every day with survivors and victims to anti-racist liberation struggles? Options. We love options. We're creative at meeting needs. Raising our voices, yeah, in union, right? Speaking with people, amplifying survivors' voices and experiences rather than talking for them, or framing them as voiceless potentially. bringing a vision of equality, equity, active listening is a really big one. We do that on the regular. It's a huge part of our trauma-informed work. I wanted to put out self-determination in a framework that is the Northwest Network of bi, trans, lesbian, and gay survivors of abuse really brings to the core of its work as sort of the backbone of advocacy and survivor-centered advocacy. And that's to honor the self-determination of survivors and their safety in that order. And I think that this framework is so helpful to come back to over and over again, because so often when we think about a service provision model or a helping profession, or a lot of people who, and there's no shame in having entered the work of combating gender-based violence from this position, but a lot of folks enter this work saying, I want to help people. And sometimes that desire to help can be really grounded in a desire to save or rescue people. And that can be dangerous, right? The courts, the human trafficking intervention courts that we were talking about earlier, have a very specific vision of safety that they want to mandate people into. And they operate in a framework that suggests that arresting people is a totally justifiable means to that end goal of safety, which they view as not trading sex. And if we put self-determination first as really the antidote to violence, to the kind of objectification and subjugation that comes from violence, we're able to really hear how Black women, especially Black trans women, Black queer and genderqueer, gender nonconforming and diverse people have been telling us all along that this isn't the solution they wanted, and they don't want it as the primary intervention. And that honoring that is going to take real work and real accountability from us to own how our movement is structured itself. And that's right at the very beginning, that picture of Cece McDonald. Cece articulated that she didn't want increased criminalization to be part of anyone acting in her name. Transformative justice has been picking up a lot of traction. I think people are starting to get more familiar with it. It really reflects a variety of responses to gender violence and other forms of interpersonal or community violence that seek resolutions within more intimate systems of community or civil society. And so it follows more radical political traditions and communities, bringing out the leadership and interests of marginalized communities to create alternative responses. And it can represent a lot of different ways that people might be trying to address violence in their communities, operating outside of a carceral framework, right? It's an approach for how we as individuals, families, communities, and society can prevent, respond to, and transform the harms that we see happening in our world. In the context of ending child sexual abuse, transformative justice is an approach that seeks healing, justice, and accountability for child sexual abuse, while also transforming the ongoing social conditions that allowed the abuse to occur. And I apologize, the citation is actually wrong at the bottom of this. I'll fix it later, but this is from the Transformative Justice Toolkit from Generation 5 for ending childhood sexual abuse. So here is a book club moment. These are things that I suggest people read to get more information about transformative justice and what different options can look like. You'll see there in the middle, Generation 5's Transformative Justice Handbook, that last quotation was from. So what are some ways that safety might look like outside of a carceral logic? And I'm not suggesting that people start facilitating community accountability sessions within the next week, but I want us to spend time really investing in what that vision of safety would look like for people to be cared for if there were no police and no prisons. Shoshana says ample funding for programs to prevent domestic and sexual violence. I would say that we would want to be really careful that that funding didn't come with requirements of collaborating with police and in this world where they wouldn't exist, right? Because a lot of our funding does that in this field. Ample housing options. Everybody would just be able to access the housing they needed. There might be community ways of taking really seriously, abhorring the violence done by people in our communities without treating those people as disposable or not deserving of the opportunity to change that behavior. And I think that's a really big part of it, right, is believing that, recognizing that prisons haven't been effective in transforming that behavior, and that we will need other mechanisms to do it. And how could prisons be effective in transforming that behavior when they are tools of domination that normalize rape and abuse? I'm holding really close with me in this work Oluwatoyin Salau, who is a 19-year-old Black Lives Matter activist who was recently found murdered. And in the days leading up to her death, her disappearance and her subsequent death, Oluwatoyin, who sometimes is fondly called Toyin or as a nickname, was advocating for Black Lives Matter at rallies, speaking out in particular for Toni McDade, as well as for Black women's unique experiences of sexual violence and patriarchal violence. And she was someone who had experienced violence at home, who was fleeing that violence or running away from that violence and seeking care at a church, was unstably housed, trusted somebody, and tweeted about the sexual assault by this person who was supposed to be, whether he was or was pretending to be, a supportive figure related to or connected to the church. And I've been thinking about a lot how Oluwatoyin was calling for abolition, for a world free from police and prisons, and what we make of what we do with her murderer and what accountability and transformation would look like for that person. And so in a world with no police, I want us to imagine what Oluwatoyin would have needed in her community and life to stay safe from harm, to have been insulated and cared for, and much less vulnerable to violence. This is pod mapping, which might be a tool people are familiar with. It's from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And it's a means for us to think about community relationships and how people are connected. And so your name would go, or the survivor's name would go in the middle of that gray circle, and the surrounding bold outline circles are the pod. And so those would be people, actual individuals who are close to you or people you would turn to for support. And I encourage people to read more about how this tool works and to think about it as a way that you could engage survivors that you work with in exploring alternatives to criminal legal solutions or responses, especially when you're working with somebody who might be saying, that's not what I want. And a harm reduction philosophy really helps us to understand models where we can bring that self-determination and honor the self-determination of people we work with, to like minimize the very real harms that might be happening in their life or that might be a result of their coping strategies. This tool relies on evidence, social justice, reducing stigma, and the desire to keep people alive. And so you might be most familiar with it in its origins of really trying to support people who are active drug users, to reduce the harms of the potential consequences of overdose or infection because of dirty needles, while not holding people to the notion that they must stop using at that time. And so I believe, and I want to put forward, that there are harm reduction strategies that we could integrate into our work that really allow us to mitigate and minimize the ways that we interact with or rely on the prison industrial complex to support survivors, and that we could start these right away. These are some core skills that come from advocacy, I think, that we bring to that challenge. We normalize the types of experiences people might have. We can prep somebody for a forensic exam or for medical services by letting them know that they might experience transphobia in that setting, and working with them to make a plan that feels best, to accompany them with what they choose to do, and to support them in researching and exploring their options, as somebody mentioned earlier. A book club moment about harm reduction and ways we might think about the path forward in our work. These are calls to our movement from Insight and Critical Resistance that came out in 2001. And so to think that this was 19 years ago, that people, women of color in particular, and trans people of color at the forefront of this intersection of advocacy to end state and intimate violence, we're putting out the exact ideas that we might need. I want to really encourage people to go to this document, to read all of them, and to pick some that you can start to integrate into your work. And so for folks who are with us right now, take a moment to reflect on and then offer one tangible commitment that you can make right now toward any of these three goals. I see that Brooke earlier was also putting forward that having evidence-based treatment programs or supports for people who cause harm, people who batter their partners, or who have raped people, or perpetrators of that violence, so to speak, would be an essential component of supporting the transformation of violence in our culture. Beatrice is committing to number 2 from this list, minimizing the harms. And I would challenge folks, if you want to pick one of these, right, as sort of a homework, to try and get as specific as possible. So maybe it's, I'm going to start by minimizing the harms of these institutions, picking number 2. And then I want to think about, like, okay, what's one way I can do that? Is it taking Call 911 off of our website? Is it taking law enforcement out of our board? What might it be? Yeah, certainly focusing on prevention as much as intervention, right? And I think in terms of prevention, like really expanding that to transformation of the culture. Okay, these are some suggestions and ideas about integrating this work. None of this is going to happen overnight. It's going to be really hard, and it's actually really demanding of us. And so, you know, I've seen a lot of folks talking about having dialogues at their offices. I've obviously been a proponent of the book club, but where can you carve out time to make this happen in your life? And then I put trauma stewardship, I think, is such an important component of this, because the work we're doing to take care of ourselves outside of our profession and our job really will open up room for us to be actors outside of just our profession or career, and our 9-to-5 time, right? To think about how might I join activism outside of my current role. how might I have the energy to do reading about anti-racism after I spent a full day talking with survivors about the violence they'd experienced? I know firsthand that that's really hard. And so finding ways that we integrate that steadily over time is incredibly important. I'm putting a call out for folks to check out and try to tune in to this webinar later this week, or it's teaching. It's with Haymarket Books, and it's focused on this Aid to Abolition platform that a lot of Black Lives Matter activists are putting forward, trying to really imagine a world where there would be zero police murders because there would be zero police. And I know that that's a really hard thing for a lot of us to imagine for survivors. But there are things on here, agenda items that we could start with. Like repealing laws that criminalize survival. That seems like a thing that we might be pretty ready to get behind as a community and as organizations. These are the additional resources. You'll get this with the slides. They're great ways to tap into more of this learning. This On the Road with Abolition, Assessing Our Steps Along the Way was phenomenal. It was really dense. If you thought my webinar was dense, you know, I know it ran longer than a lot of you had actually planned, which I apologize for. But this was really dense. I'm going to be actually returning back to it too in my pages and pages of notes to learn from some folks who are incredibly knowledgeable about and at the forefront of leading for abolition feminism. And so this is the question I leave us with, which is how will we reimagine our role? We took stock of it in this poll, and we identified these complicated ways that we might be enmeshed with policing in our movement. And so who will we be, and what will our movement look like if we recommit ourselves to freedom for the most marginalized survivors? And that means really heeding the lessons that are being offered to us, the guidance from I will say, Black leaders in particular, Native leaders in particular, as well as the victims that we've lost to police violence, as well as intimate violence. And so you made it. Thank you to the 46 participants who carved out an extra half hour to stick around with me and think about abolition feminism and think about a new path forward for reimagining our work. I appreciate everyone's time so much. And Heather will be available to you all to answer questions. And she and I will certainly be in touch if there are additional things that I can support you all with as you're learning and moving forward. So thank you all so much. And I look forward to fighting with you until we create the world we want to see.